안녕하세요. 저는 Oriol입니다. Okay, thank you very much for joining Hipra on this event. Today we are going to talk about sow mortality. Okay, sow mortality is a very important challenge nowadays in our farms. So today we will talk about the risk factors, the consequences, and the economic impact of this disease. The truth is that despite there is a lot of bibliography published around sow mortality, here you can see the evolution of the publication since 50 years ago, there are still many answers, many questions that we need to answer about sow mortality. Today we will try to put some light on these questions, but first I would like to share with you, for example, the evolution of the sow mortality in the United States. Here you have the data from two big databases, MetaFarms and PigChamps, two companies in the United States that they are recording data, and this is data from 1.6 million sows and more than 640 farms. You can see that the evolution of the sow mortality has been increasing from 2017, where the sow mortality was around 10%, until 2021, where the sow mortality was reaching an average rate of 15%. I would also like to share information from where we are. We are from Spain, and this is the evolution of the sow mortality in Spain. In this graph, you can see three different lines. The green line represents the worst farms in Spain, and the blue line represents the worst farms in Spain. You can see that all the sow mortality is increasing in all types of farms, the best ones and the worst ones. So today the presentation will try to put some light on three big questions. Why the sows are dying, when these sows are dying, and which are the risk factors, and finally, which are the consequences in terms of economic for our farms. So let's start with the question why the animals are dying. And the reason is that we don't know it. Actually, this article was published in the pig site, and it was mentioning that 39% of the sows that are dying for unknown reasons. Okay, this is because we don't normally practice necropsies in sows, as we normally practice necropsies with the fattening pigs. So if we are not practicing the necropsies, it's very, very important to look at the data. Record the data very carefully on the farm, and after that, analyze all the statistics. And I want to give an example of this. Here we have a list of different reasons about why a sow could die. If we record the mortality just as a general parameter, for example, in this case, we can think that this farm has problems because of the non-cyclic sows, the non-pregnant sows, so reproductive diseases, and because of the age. But if we work on a pragmatic way, and we separate the general sows, general death sows in deaths, euthanized, it means that sows that we are euthanizing and the sows that we are sending to a slaughterhouse, we can have different information. In this case, for example, we can see that this farm is euthanizing the sows because of the prolapses and because of the lameness. And the main cause of death in sows is the acute death. So now we are going to focus on this acute death, because there's a big list of reasons that can lead to sow mortality and cause acute death. This is a study published in Denmark, where they were listing all the causes of sudden death in sows, where you can see that 49% of the mortality in the farm is because of displacement or torsions of the organs of the animal. Here I want to show a video about a liver torsion. Okay, the torsion in this case is counterclockwise, and most of the times these torsions are caused by an increase of the abdominal pressure on the sow. For example, a sow that has not been eating for 1 or 2 days, and then the animal starts eating a lot, it will increase the abdominal pressure, and this can lead to a liver torsions. There are many reasons that can cause an increase of abdominal pressure. One is the feed, but the other one is the gas. You know that one of the bacteria that is producing gas in the sows is Clostridium novi. Clostridium novi is an anaerobic bacteria. It's a gram-positive anaerobic bacteria that is producing a toxin called the alpha toxin. This alpha toxin has tropism for especially two types of cells: the hepatocytes, cells from the liver, and the endothelial cells, cells from the blood vessels. Once this toxin enters to the cell, it will destroy the cytoskeleton, the structure of the hepatocytes, and this will lead to the final organ failure. The final image that we will have in the farm are these typical lesions of the liver. Here you have more pictures. This is how the sows suffering from clostridiosis they appear. This with this generalized edema, purple color. If we perform the necropsy of the sow, we can see that the liver is bigger than the normal, with gas bubbles on the parenchyma. Now I would like to move to the second point, which is when are the sows dying? Which are the risk factors that we need to consider when we are in front of a sow mortality problem in your farms? So the first thing that has been demonstrated is that there's a seasonal effect on the sow mortality. In this trial published by Koketsu 5 years ago, they were just demonstrating that there is a period during the winter time where the sow mortality is the lower of the year. There's a period where the sow mortality is higher during the hot season, the summertime. And then we have two intermediate periods, which are between January and March and April, June, which means autumn and spring, where the sow mortality is ranging between both time points. That's a study that we performed in Korea, okay, where we were evaluating the vaccination of Clostridium novi. You can see in brown color the period without vaccination, and in green color the period with vaccination. There's a reduction of the mortality, but beyond that, you can see that between 2015 and 2019, there are peaks of mortality, okay, that are related with the summertime. So in Korea also there is this seasonal effect of the sow mortality. The second point is the management, okay, and the management is related with the farm productivity. This is a trial published just a few months ago, okay, that was correlating the piglets weaned per sow per year in a farm with the sow mortality. What we can see from this graph is that those farms that they are weaning more piglets per sow per year, they have less sow mortality. In this case, when the piglets weaned per year is 32, the sow mortality is 9.5. And when we decrease the percentage of piglets weaned per sow per year, we are increasing the sow mortality. This means that there's a component related with the management. Those farms that are managing properly the piglets are also managing properly the sows. So there's a human factor on the sow mortality. Another parameter that is related with the sow mortality, and also published by Koketsu, is the parity. In this graph, you can see the chances to survive. Okay, one means that the sow is not dying, and as we get close to zero, it means that the sow has more chances to die. You can see that in the top of the graph, we have the low parity sows, the young sows, and in the bottom, we have the old sows. So the old sows is the most susceptible population in our farms. First message of this graph, but the second message is related with this part, with the weeks post-mating. You can see that around the week 16 after mating, there's a decrease or an increase of sow mortality in all parities, and it's related with the peripartum. The peripartum is the more risky period of the whole productive cycle of the sow. This is the same publication and with the same information, but organized in a different way, where you can clearly see this is the evolution, the weeks pre and post mating, and there is an increase of mortality around day 0, which is the partum, the farrowing moment. So the reason why there's a higher incidence of mortality during the peripartum has to do with the proper development of the physiology of the piglets and the sow. Here you can see a graph where we have the fetal weight gain, and you can see that during the first third of gestation, if we compare it with the last third of gestation, the growth of the litter is almost 9 times higher during the last part than compared with the first part of the lactation. And this is with the fetal weight gain, but the same happens with the protein. This is the evolution of the protein of the fetuses, and you can see that during the last third of gestation, it's 19 times higher than the beginning of the gestation. So this increase of the productivity of the sow has a consequence, and the consequence is related with the oxidative stress. The oxidative stress is increasing after the day 30 of gestation, reaching the highest point during the late gestation. This oxidative stress is the one that is going to cause the metabolic damage to the sow during the peripartum. In this article, they are mentioning the consequences that the oxidative stress has, and it can affect the development of the placenta. It also predisposes the sow to farrow piglets suffering from intrauterine growth restriction. Also, it can affect the reproductive performance, the fertility of the animal in the future, and finally, it causes as well liver damage. This is increasing the risk to suffer mortality. So, last year we wanted to evaluate the impact of the vaccination against Clostridium novi during the peripartum, and for this we did a very important collaboration with a Danish company managing more than 225,000 sows. We know that Clostridium novi is affecting the sow during this peripartum phase because the concentration of oxygen in the liver is low. So we wanted to compare those farms that were immunized against Clostridium novi with those farms that they were not immunized against Clostridium novi. So here you have 4 graphs, okay? Each graph represents one farm. And for each graph you have the mortality during the different phases. From day 0 to day 30, day 30 to 60, 61 to 90, 90 to 110, and more than 110 days. What we saw when we were analyzing the different patterns of mortality, we realized that those farms that were vaccinated with against Clostridium novi, the mortality during the peripartum was not increasing, and in those farms where they were not immunized against Clostridium novi, we had an increase of mortality during the peripartum. During this trial, we were involving more than 20 farms. Okay, so here we summarize all the information that we saw. Here you can see in a very simple way that those farms that were not immunized against Clostridium novi, all of them had mortality during the peripartum, while those farms that they were immunized against Clostridium novi, most of them, they didn't show mortality during the peripartum. Actually, this is something that it was evaluated from the statistical point of view with significant results. And what we saw is that those farms immunized against novi had 35 times less chances to suffer some mortality, so sudden death during the peripartum. The next step was to evaluate the sow mortality. So what we did is we compared the overall sow mortality during the peripartum and not the peripartum with those farms that were not immunizing against Clostridium novi and those farms that were immunizing against novi. What we can see here is that we moved from a 26% to a 14.7%. So when we use novi vaccination, we are able to minimize the mortality during this time point. So now it's time to move to the third point that we want to talk about the consequences, probably one of the most important parts of the presentation. Summarizing, sow mortality has 2 big consequences. The first one is that every sow that is dying means that one new sow needs to enter to the farm. So if we have high mortality, we will need to have high replacement rate, and this will affect the optimal parity distribution in our farms. So this is a graph representing the normal parity distribution. If we increase the percentage of gills, what we will have is we will decrease the productive performance of the farm because we know that gills are more susceptible to have, for example, less borderline piglets, less winning weight. They have they need more time to return to the estrus. They also have less fertility, so we will decrease the farrowing rate. And we also no need to talk about the impact that this will have on the sanitary point of view for diseases like neonatal diarrhea or PRRS, that they are more susceptible population to suffer from it. And let's move to the second consequence, for the economic impact of sow mortality. For this, I would like to do an exercise, okay? Because one of the characteristics of the sow mortality is that every time is different. It's very hard to estimate the economic cost of the sow mortality because depending on the moment that the sow is dying, it will have one impact or another. So I want you to look at the sow number 1, okay? Let's think that we are in front of a sow dying on the second cycle, okay? So a young animal dying during the first third of gestation. Imagine that it's dying on the day 35. The depreciation of the genetic, okay, so the value that we have been able to obtain from this animal is going to be very low. So the depreciation is going to be high. The economic impact is going to be high. And the value of the gestation, meaning the feed, the housing, the management, is going to be low because we're talking about an animal during the first third of gestation. So in this case, in a sow with these characteristics, we can more or less establish that the economic cost that this animal has is around 341 euros. Now let's move to the second example, okay, the sow number 1. Note that we are talking about a sow also dying on the second parity, but in this case, instead of dying on the first third of gestation, it's dying during the late gestation. The economic impact that this will have on the amount of feed that this animal has eaten is going to be very high. That's why the final economic impact of a sow dying during the peripartum, during the late gestation, is going to be much higher. If we still stay here on the late gestation and we move to the third animal, instead of that it's dying instead of the second parity, it's an old animal, the amortization that we have obtained from this animal has been very high. That's why we can say that more or less after the fifth parity, okay, the value of the genetics is going to be 0. That's why in this case we talk about an economic cost of 336 euros. So you can see that the economic cost is it depends a lot on the case. But let's do an exercise, okay, and let's think that we have an average cost of sow mortality around 362 euros. If we are facing a farm, okay, if we imagine a farm with 1,000 animals, to make it easy, with 10% of mortality, an average mortality that according to what we have seen before, it's not that strange, the economic impact of the sow mortality is going to be around 36,000 euro. If we implement measures from the feed to the immunization or the management or the climatization or whatever, and we are able to minimize the sow mortality from 10% to 8%, just 2 point reduction, the economic benefit that this farm will have is going to be more than 7,000 euro. So to conclude my presentation, I would like to highlight 3 take-home messages. The first one is related with the data. Okay, the more data we have, the more data we analyze, the more knowledge we will have, the better will be the decisions that we can take at the farm level and understand which is the real cause of sow mortality. We also have seen that there is a risk period around the peripartum, okay, where we suffer more mortality and where the cost of the sow is going to be higher. Okay, so any measure that we implement during the peripartum is going to help us to reduce the mortality in those expensive sows in our farms. And my last message would be not to worry on the economic of the sow mortality when we want to implement measures, because as you have seen, the economic impact of the sow mortality is very high. So in the short or mid-term, this money that we are putting in the farm to solve sow mortality will have a return of the investment because of the high cost of this disease. So that's it. At Hipra, you know that as one of the solutions that we have is that to help you to decrease this sow mortality is related with the Suisang. Suisang is a neonatal diarrhea vaccine, our neonatal diarrhea vaccine that is including as well the alpha toxin of Clostridium novi to protect the piglets against the scours and the sows against the sow mortality. One of the big changes that Suisang will suffer, as you can see here, we are renaming Suisang as Suisang colici. This is because in Europe we have started launching a new vaccine that is going to be called Suisang Difei. So in order to differentiate the two vaccines, we have just put it a surname, Suisang colici and Suisang Difei. Suisang Difei is going to be a vaccine, okay, that will arrive hope soon in Korea against Clostridium difficile, Clostridium perfringens type A. So one of the characteristics of these two vaccines is that in the future they will be able to be mixed in one single 4 ml injections. So in one injection you will have all the protection against bacterial neonatal diarrhea agents, but also the sow mortality of Clostridium novi. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, we can discuss them later. Thank you.
모돈폐사 감사합니다.